Okay, welcome back to the second half of our session today. Next, we have a presentation from the Lived Experience panel uh, of the Mass Step Lived Experience Committee. So I'll do the introductions, and I think we're really looking forward to this one. So the Lived Experience panel consists of Vera Muñiz-Sare, CPS MPH, pronouns they, she, elle, ella. Vera is a non-binary, queer, mixed Peruvian, master's level public health professional with Spanish and indigenous Andean ancestry who works on peer-focused projects through the Massachusetts Department of Mental Health, Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center, and McLean Hospital. Vera has been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder and ADHD and is a survivor of conversion therapy targeting their sexuality and identifies as MAD and a psychiatric survivor. Next, we have Lionel Frechette, pronouns they, them, is a deaf, multiply disabled queer person with 16 years of living with extreme states and 6 years of both working within the mental health system in different capacities and receiving services, bringing their personal experience and person-centered ethics to the table. They enjoy creating art and poetry, Mario Kart, and listening to vinyl records with friends. Their ultimate dream is to create equity through diverse spaces and strengthen allyship across communities. Next, we have Locke Ironwood, CPS, pronouns they, elle. This is a 36-year-old and identifies as a psychiatric abuse survivor. They're a disabled, queer, BIPOC, non-binary poet and musician descended from the Kalingo tribe of the West Indies. Locke grew up in a rich indigenous culture as a part of Boston's West Indian community. Locke was diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder in 2008 when they were 19 years old. However, their onset may have been as young as 12. Locke received their CPS in 2020 and is trained to facilitate alternative to suicide groups. Locke is involved in grassroots organizing for the trans community, unhoused individuals, and the MAD community at large. Locke frequently performs spoken word at open mics in Boston. Locke is currently working on publishing their collection of poems. Next, we have Tyler Yosma, pronouns he, el. Tyler grew up in his hometown, North Philadelphia, for his formative years. Embracing his Haitian and Puerto Rican culture, solidified from his childhood home, Tyler has lived in Boston for the past 11 years, working as youth access chair for the Massachusetts Psychosis Prevention Partnership Lived Experience Committee, as a board member of Salud, and Suffolk University graduate with bachelor's in English. And last but not least, we have Vesper Moore, pronouns they, elle, is an Indigenous activist and leader. They are deeply committed to promoting mental health and disability rights through activism, leadership, organizing, public speaking, and education. Vesper has contributed to the establishment of mental health organizations worldwide and has been an advocate for civil rights in the United States. Collaborating with the United States government and the United Nations, Vesper helps shape strategies around trauma, intersectionality, and disability rights. The title of their presentation is The Politics of Asking for Support. Okay, turning it over to you guys.
Hey, y'all. Just trying to get everybody added to the spotlights. Perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much for that intro dose. And hi, everybody. We are the Lived Experience Committee for the Massachusetts Psychosis Prevention Partnership, or at least some of the leadership from that committee. We have other folks as well who are involved, and some of them are here as well. And I'm really happy to be able to moderate this discussion today. My name is Vera, and I'm one of the coordinators on Massachusetts Psychosis Prevention Partnership. And with me today are Lionel and Locke, my co-executive chairs, Vesper, our peer workforce chair, and Tyler, our youth access chair. So just to get us a little bit started, and just to give an introduction to sort of our experiences, I think we're all just gonna go down the line and start off with what are some of our most memorable early experiences of asking or receiving support. What was helpful and what was horrible, and like being honest about those experiences. And just a reminder, since we have the ASL interpreter, to just try to speak a little bit slowly so that they can effectively interpret.
I can speak a little. Oh, I'm so sorry, Locke. Okay, I can speak a little bit to my experience. I know when I first started experiencing different things and what my peers were, I was in college and I ended up seeing a psychiatrist for what I was experiencing, which was hearing voices at the time. And at that time, I tried to articulate some of the what I was experiencing to him, but because I felt I seemed put together to him, he said, "Well, you're not seeing Jesus and toast, so you're fine." And I felt very like alone because of that, because I didn't have any community of people who are experiencing similar things, and I didn't have any advice on how to navigate what I was experiencing. So I think that was overall a negative first impression.
I appreciate you giving that perspective, Lionel. I think that that's something that commonly happens, particularly if like whenever there's like this idea of like high and low functioning that's brought into a clinical environment, there's always like questions about our own experiences that can come up. Um, Anybody else?
I can speak to that. So I think my initial sort of experience was not great. I will say that parts of it were really traumatic and I don't remember a lot of it. I will say that uh, one of the things that were a really big theme in my sort of like early introduction to the system is the lack of autonomy and just like constant disrespect and dehumanization. um those are themes that were constantly through sort of like my initial care into like my first real break. And I would best describe that as perhaps like getting caught in a riptide in the ocean. Like I'm just having fun swimming, and all of a sudden a riptide is pulling me out into the ocean. That's kind of what it feels like to be in this system. Like you're getting pulled further and further into a place you never asked to be, and you're just kind of hoping you don't drown, but you don't feel like you have any control. Fight the current as much as you want. That riptide is stronger than you. And that's kind of like my first experience, my early experience.
I really appreciate that perspective, Luck, and I can definitely relate a lot to that imagery. Go for it, Tyler.
So, growing up, I was the only child for much of my life. So, because of that and the seclusion from an abusive parent in my household, furthermore, I had an environment you didn't want to be around a lot. So, with that in mind, of course, you had to keep yourself at bay a lot. You had to have fun by yourself. So, instinctually, I would talk to myself or things like that. So, that was overdrawn to a certain point where I remember I was about 5, might have been 6, and I'll never forget the cops were called and I was taken to an ER. So there's a lot of like you're strapped to a gurney and you don't know what's happening. Mind you, I was a kid, so like I couldn't really understand what was going on as well. So with that in mind, I remember waiting in a hospital room for I think it was about 26 hours straight. And you can't really sleep because it's freezing cold, it's very dark, and there's a lot of screaming and crying from other kids and whatnot. So I'll never forget a lot of the environment. I didn't really find a lot of answers or communication on what was going on. So that was very, very difficult. And it made me fear not only inpatient, but it made me fear kind of asking for help a lot. So what did help early on in those experiences was family support, like cars and them bringing food because they didn't realize that I didn't eat the food at an inpatient and I felt lonelier than ever. So that's why a lot of peer work is what I do now.
I really appreciate you speaking to that experience, Tyler. I think that a lot of us have a lot of experience with the psychiatric system being used as a tool of coercive control. And of course, Vesper.
Yeah, I think echoing a lot of what Tyler just shared, my initial experience with the mental health system as a teenager was in the capacity of something that wasn't particularly inviting or community oriented. And it was difficult, I would say at first. I was struggling with thoughts and feelings of suicide, um, as many other, as it's usually described. I did actively have what's often described as a plan, right? And I was in the hospital, and I don't think it was actually until after I was out of my my first stay that I was starting to get exposed to other community resources. But it really didn't stick for me till I was introduced to peer support in the community. So I started to meet certified peer specialists and peer support groups. And I found in that environment, that's when I started to feel more connected to community mental health as a whole. I feel like in inpatient environments and being in that space where I was really activated, it was difficult to connect in that way.
Absolutely. There's a lot of ways I feel like a lot of our crisis care structures that are themselves feeling very unapproachable to the people who are forced to rely on them a lot. And there's a lot of ways in which that, like, all the things that y'all mentioned before compound into like building distrust, not only in the treatment structures and facilities themselves, but with the providers that are like supposed to be providing us care as well. I'm also going to be putting the chats going forward in the chat so for easy access for y'all. So our next question is, has there been a significant way that you've noticed that medical providers have treated you differently on the basis of your identities or the experiences that you hold?
I can definitely say that for myself on the base.
Is Vesper frozen for other folks as well? Give it a minute. Okay, we lost them. We can come back to them though. Does anybody else have anything to add in terms of? Oh wait, they're back. Never mind.
Sorry about that. I was just saying very, very early on, I I did experience a lot of moments where on the basis of my identity, which was race, really, where I would describe a lot of things that me and my family were going through. I've mentioned this a lot recently when I share my story, but my mom immigrated to the United States from the Dominican Republic before I was born, and navigating the mental health system and often helping my mother, like when we would, for example, getting cable set up and the cable providers making fun of her because she can't speak English, right? So there was a lot of difficult moments where for me as a young adult I had to serve as a liaison for my family, so I would describe a lot of those experiences and a lot of other experiences. And I remember talking about that potential bias and then being told by some of my providers at the time that I was being very anxious, right? That there wasn't actually something happening, but rather it was anxiety related. So for me, I found that very dismissive. And it wasn't until I connected to other Latinx providers, other providers who shared similar experiences, where I found a better outcome um, for myself. So,
Absolutely. I appreciate like you saying that, Vesper. There's like a critical way in which like having somebody who looks like you or at least can understand your experiences without like you having to over explain it is so healing. Any other thoughts?
I think something I can speak to on this one is that essentially, yeah, like, I'd come into a lot of mental health spaces with therapists and psychiatrists provided by the state, and just sort of, being aware that I'm being treated differently. Um, just like being aware that, like, the white folks coming into those offices were receiving a lot more just like respect than I was. And even sometimes given different medication options based on like things they assume about like, well, we can offer, you know, person X who is white, um, you know, this medication because they are not, you know, they're not going to misuse them. But you know, the history of the Black community and drug abuse, so we probably shouldn't offer you that medication. We probably shouldn't even put it on the table. And just like being like and like having conversations with other peers who are just given things without question, um without a problem, and being sort of faced with the idea that like it's always going to be different for me.
Absolutely. I can really connect with that, Locke. I think there's a very real way in which like people of color really have to, even if they supposedly are labeled as like high functioning or having insight, very constantly have to like navigate around racist assumptions around like substance use and like controlled substances that are used as medication particularly. And like the idea of like being med seeking is something that I know we've talked about a lot in our sessions, like as a lived experience committee too. Go for it, Tyler.
So often for my appearance, you can't assume of my background. So I come from a Boricua and a Haitian background. So early on is that I was very attuned with my languages. So like now I would switch without really knowing it to Creole or Spanish. Because when you start inpatient or even outpatient, something like that, they blood draw you. I was blood drawn at least 3 or 4 times a day, sometimes multiple times in an hour, at least like multiple times within a lot. So they used to ask me over and over and over again, do you smoke weed? Are you on heroin and cocaine? And I would be horrified because I was not even a teenager and I had no idea how to get them. But it came from one of my language and that I don't look, at least how I was told at the time, where my culture comes from. So they didn't know what box to put me in. Furthermore, is that I came from a different neighborhood than a lot of these people, which is not my identity necessarily. So that was always used against me. So that didn't help with my languages. So I stopped speaking my languages as much. Only recently have I gotten back to them. So more recently, I had a negative experience with the provider because I attempted suicide in 2020, and I had to write a lot about that to confront that. But I tried to overdose. So when I did so, the provider took that and considered me med seeking, and the fact that I had substance issues, even though that was the furthest from the thing. And when I told them is that the reason I did so is because my mother, who was very abusive, was the reason who did so and told me to do so. Um, then a report and as well as other things were drawn on to me as saying I was violent, I was dysfunctional, and that I threatened her, even though I did the furthest from the thing. And more so is that I've had people within, whether they're mentors, family, or friends, that would say, I'm the furthest from all those things. So that was very hurtful. And it didn't also help that I also often didn't have agency with medication. So I didn't really even have the ability to know what was the balance of it. So I always feared things like that. I feared even standing up for myself often because I'm like, well, like then I'm dysfunctional and then I can't like trust myself, even though I'm very confident that in my character in that way.
Absolutely, Tyler. I think you bring up a few good points and like the ways in which like we are in many ways required to code switch in order to survive in a lot of these environments, and how that can very often create contexts. Um, okay, there we go. They can create a lot of contexts where we have no control in our own situation, and where we feel very often that we have to be disconnected from our own culture in order to be able to survive in these medical contexts. And I really appreciate that perspective. Go for it, Lionel.
Um, I think my experience was predominantly, I think that my whiteness afforded me a lot more flexibility and belief as compared to the people that I know who are of color who saw the same doctors as me. And so they were much more accommodating towards me. They were much more, credulous of me in regards to, like, there was a point in my life where I had a drinking problem. And when I told my providers I was not drinking anymore in excess, they believed me, which is very much not true for many people who do, particularly when they are labeled as med seeking or a substance use disorder. So that was one thing that I noticed in terms of my identity. The other thing that I noticed in terms of my identity, which is a different one but intersecting, is my gender. There were providers that I had who did not really know what transgender meant. And so I have a long-term relationship with my current provider, but they were out on vacation for a period of time. And during this period of time, I decided to pursue surgery. And the provider that I had in the meantime was they were not aware of what surgery was for trans people. And so it was very difficult to try and explain what, like bottom surgery is or top surgery or anything like that for anything that's trans related. So I ended up actually just deferring until my regular psychiatrist came back, just because it wasn't acceptable to me to try to explain to someone the very basic tenets of what I wanted in the first.
Absolutely. I think you bring up a lot of ways in which like our own identities change the amount of agency we have in a space. Something we've also talked about like in small like bits and flavors has been the idea of being like high functioning or low functioning or like having insight, and how like those experiences themselves can also make it's like that. It's what I hear people in like disability say often, is that the label of high functioning is used to deny people support. The label of low functioning is used to deny people agency. And I think that that's something that's very real and something that we can feel a lot in this space. Um, Sweet. Our next question is, has navigating a system that is based in a traditional Western American cultural understanding and approach to support made it easier or more difficult to ask for help?
Of course, when I start talking, a truck goes by. Um, I would say for me, it's been a lot more difficult to ask for support in a sort of American Western cultural system. I think that, one of the first experiences that I had with, being called like schizophrenic or, schizoaffective or whatever label they wanted to put on me at the time was that, this was a life-ending event. Like, I'm sorry, you drew the short straw, game over for you. Like, that's just kind of the attitude all of my providers were taking, and the attitude that something is wrong with me, that I can't do certain things, that I would never be able to work ever again, is something that I was explicitly told. Even such things as I had a provider some years ago, maybe 15 years ago now, but they said to me, if depression is the common cold of the brain, then what you have is the cancer. Um, and that's not the most uncommon thing to be said to a brown person in this society. So I think for me, taking an approach to see what like my ancestors would have done, what indigenous people would have done, and what is often called a curse is being transformed into a gift. And I feel like looking at the positive aspects of what my experiences have given me spiritually and emotionally has been more effective and given me a better life than like the idea that something is inherently wrong with me.
I really appreciate that, Luck, and I resonate a lot with that as well. Like there's a way in which like reconnecting itself has been to my own family's like indigenous ancestry has also been like a very healing experience to be able to make sense of my own experiences of alternate states. Vesper, you unmuted before. Did you want to go next?
Yeah, I wanted to say like I appreciate this question a lot. And like the first thing that I think of is I know that when we refer to traditional systems, people think of conventional systems, right? Um, Amongst most indigenous peoples, we usually use the term traditional to refer to traditional healing or traditional practice, right? But in the Western context, it's always it can always be a challenge because of how certain things are poised. There's a lot in place when we talk about first access to services, and then when you access those services, what does that look like, right? And I think a big part of it is similarly to what Locke was describing for my life experience. It was initially like, okay, you have this disorder. It was also referred to as schizoaffective disorder at the time. And now I know for myself, it was trauma-induced psychosis in a lot of ways, or a lot of other varying experiences. But I don't think that the social context was really looked at in terms of what was happening to me environmentally and where I was. I grew up in a neighborhood with a lot of gun violence. I lost a dear friend. He was only 15 years old. His name was Gustavo. He died by suicide. Right. I I saw a lot of people in my life struggling, and the environmental conditions of where I was growing up in Section 8 housing were not really like these environments where I was going to really like thrive and grow in. So it's like, of course, I started experiencing some level of distress. And of course, when I started to not sleep and I was grieving and struggling with these things, I started to hear things, see things, and struggle in other ways. So I think environmental context is hugely important. And I think in Western medicine, we see things that mention, look at environment, look at this, but the focus is more on the biological and the psychological rather than the social. And I think that reframe needs to happen in order for us to feel a little bit more welcomed in the conventional systems that we know today. But yeah, my experience at first was not super welcoming, but I was fortunate to find practices that I would say either exist in Western medicine but don't operate in the ways that convention Western medicine has always operated in. So
That really resonates with me, Vesper. I really appreciate you sharing that. I think that like there's a lot of ways in taking a social approach to how we address like accessibility structures is critical. Go for it, Tyler.
To kind of go off of what y'all are saying, I like to once I started learning unconventional coping mechanisms that also could help with medication because medication kind of did not help in my experience because it made me foggy a lot and it didn't help me cognitive as I wanted to be. So therefore, I couldn't really, of course, the symptoms got worse because I was sedated, I was sleepy all the time. And granted, I told, I believe it was my father when I was in my hometown a couple weeks ago that at all sides, I was getting attacked in a way because I would go from a household that was unwelcoming to an environment that was unwelcoming to inpatient that was unwelcoming. So of course you're going to like make, as a kid even, you're going to make a world where you can feel safe. Often I learned that my body now has a jerk reaction to protect myself where it can say, okay, that is wrong, that is wrong, that is wrong because that is all I've had to do. So when it comes to medication itself, I feel if I could change anything about how it would happen with me, is that maximize the support around it. And again, like you said, the environmental aspect. I grew up playing bomba with my grandmother in West Philly. Um, music has music has always been wonderful for me, but when I was inpatient, I wasn't allowed to really do that. So the best I could do was I used to write notes on everywhere. Like I used to write actual music on like notebooks, and if we had chalkboard or whiteboards, they used to get sick of me. But if I couldn't even tap, which I will do, like I'm doing it now, which is something that is a grounding technique for me, because that is something that comes from my culture, and I wasn't allowed to do it. So that around it was not really acknowledged. And matter of fact, it was kind of dumbed down. So even if I was too loud at home, it was like, you're playing music. You can't be playing music this loud. That was kind of hurtful because that's how I always grounded myself. Even now, as I hear a lot of things and I navigate things that help with paranoia within a musical structure. And if I kind of was kept away from that for a long time, it limited my growth over time.
I appreciate that perspective, Tyler. Like, there's a very real way in which, like, our own cultural connections to the things that bring us joy are like very critical in our own recovery process. And like having denial of those things is like can create its own level of discomfort as well, in addition to our own experiences. And sort of in that sort of same realm, our next question that we've got that we talked a little bit about in small bits before, but how do criminal and carceral responses to people who experience voices, visions, and alternate states of being tangibly create situations of harm, danger, and violation of autonomy?
I would say in a lot of ways. So I think first I usually like to start with when we talk about ableism, right, which impacts people with mental health challenges or otherwise. And then we think about experiences that we call hearing voices, visions, or what people often describe as psychosis, right, or altered states. These these experiences are often not only conflated with like perceived inability, but people are also perceived as dangerous. And I think the perception of danger comes from, oh my goodness, I wouldn't know what I would do if I had lost control in that way. Or, oh, what if my kid lost control in that way? Or sometimes when I was seeking support from other providers or working with providers and professional peer support roles, I'd hear from some providers, they would say, well, Vesper, you're not as sick as my patients. And normally, like the notion that's like a part of that is usually like you're not as dangerous, you're not as unstable, you're not as disconnected or unclear, right? So because of this perception, this can often lead to a criminality on a policy level that we see often. I'd say right now we see it a lot with people who are currently houseless, who, as I was describing in my own story, like there are people who are houseless who might have struggle with sleeping, or their environment might not be great, and they might be hearing voices or seeing things as a result of that. And instead of being met with a compassionate, understanding community care that is voluntary, there can tend to be an involuntary response, which is to remove them because they are trespassing on private property, or they are not in the right place, where rather if we had resources embedded in those communities in the first place that could either prevent those conditions or address those conditions, we could have a better society. So I'd say the examples of criminality vary. I think that there's a lot of discussion around gun violence and people who hear voices and see things, and other forms of mental health challenges and disabilities, when in fact we are 11 times more likely to die as a result of police intervention, to die as a result of violence, and yet we are often the ones labeled as dangerous. So I think that's where I would like to start. It's a social perception of criminality that does affect things on a policy level.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Vesper. I'm gonna stop commenting so we can keep it moving. Go for it, Tyler.
How much I relate to that. Growing up, if all you see is homeless people or people as a whole who just walk around who are darker than you, just be assaulted by everyone. It's everywhere, and it's not just here, it's not just there, it's everywhere. It gets upsetting over time. And therefore you start to fear it yourself, and that is paralyzing. And that's where I didn't really know what was paranoia wasn't, because that's all you see and you see. Within myself is that I was suicidal for a very long time, to the point a clinician, when I was about 8 years old, told me I would never make it to 18. But to go on to that point is that it's very difficult when it comes to that, because now that you're so scared of even like giving someone a look is or standing up for yourself, is that when you feel those emotions, you're so terrified of someone calling the cops on you and then finding out your diagnosis or something, that you start to turn it internal, and that is not helpful. And even more so, you don't tell anyone because you're like, maybe I'll do it to them too. So now it gets worse, and now you're secluded, and now you're on a path that you may never come back from. And I feel lucky that I came back from that. Now I'm here, but it was never certain.
Absolutely. I really appreciate that, Tyler. And I think you also speak to some of the anxieties we talked about in the group about like mandated reporting, with like young children have a lot of difficulty seeking out supports, especially if they're aware of the ways that like more carceral systems that deprioritize their autonomy could be used. Go for it, Lionel.
I was like a student in the public school system growing up for most of my life. And I was very visibly, I guess I would say neurodivergent is the way that I would describe it when I was in elementary school. And therefore, I was like a target of police violence because of the embedded police that were at my school. I grew up in New Bedford. At that time, it was a very difficult place to live, I would say. And so, like, because of that, I grew up with an embedded response to police that was just sheer panic whenever I saw them. And so, when I realized that, if I were visibly different, if I spoke about hearing voices or seeing visions, then the police would be called on me. I felt very averse to sharing my experiences at all, and averse to seeking out other people who share those experiences, just because I didn't know how to articulate it in a way that felt safe. And so a lot of the expectations also that my providers had were, like, you'll be, if you're a good patient, you'll be good. You won't be like incarcerated either psychiatrically or criminally, and you'll be fine. But one of the things that I was thinking about was I would like to have lived with dignity, however I was able to. And so one of the things I often think about as well is that there are people who choose to live outdoors, and they deserve to live with dignity and autonomy without being policed as well as the option to live indoors. Because a lot of the time, the rhetoric is, if you choose to live this way, then you're crazy. So that was one of the things I was thinking about. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you so much, Lionel. Any other thoughts?
I just have a really quick anecdote to share about carceral methods. I think that for me, the only reason I haven't been able to I've been psychiatrically incarcerated, but never criminally, And I think the only reason that's true is because I can run faster. Like, to be real, like, it's not that the cops aren't called on me. I'm just like, I just go. Like, so one of the things that is really wild for me, there was a local church, I want to say in Somerville, maybe, um, that and this was like maybe 15 years ago, I was going through a really, really hard time. And being evangelical was part of my psychosis. Um, so I actually came into this church during their services and just declared myself to be Jesus. Um, I It was what it was. Like, psychosis is psychosis. I can't like take that back. But their response is like, if you don't leave, we're gonna call the police. And I left very quickly because they were calling the police. And I just never went even on that block in Somerville for years. I was so scared. Um, it's so funny because years later, I ended up like kind of marching in a little parade and walking by that church and kind of having a little heart attack because I'm like, do they still recognize me? So like, the frustration of like people will threaten you with incarceral methods to be like, we're helping you, and it's disguised as help. But I think that for me, coming into a place of like, hey, I'm a person in the world and I just could really use some assistance, having like been to that church before as someone who like followed that method, right? So like it's just frustrating looking at incarceral methods. um they are not humane and they do not provide autonomy to people.
Yeah, I definitely resonate with what you're saying there, Locke. I wanna keep an eye on the time, and I know that we've talked a lot about a lot of like heavy subjects in terms of like the carcerality of our current mental health system, and all of the sort of violence that we've experienced firsthand as a result of it. But I do want to pivot a little bit before we go to questions, and just so we can end on sort of like the things that have been positive for us in our own support seeking journeys. And so my last question is, what are the biggest differences between the people that we serve? Oh, sorry. What are the biggest differences the people that we serve notice in the dynamics between seeking support from clinicians versus from peer professionals? And I'm specifically thinking of like, what are the benefits that people see when they seek out peer professionals, as opposed to clinical professional supports? Go for it, Lionel.
I hope it's okay that I share my experience with a peer, even if it wasn't necessarily a peer professional. One of the big things in my kind of recovery and navigation was knowing someone my age who ended up also having the same kind of onsets of what are considered symptoms at the same time as me, and being able to share what I was experiencing in a very frank way with them, as well as them sharing their experiences with me. And that really helped me like determine what was something that I wanted to change and that I felt was harming me in a real intangible way or inconveniencing me versus things that I felt I could find value and meaning in as experiences. And so with my providers, it was often framed as like, all of this under this umbrella is bad. You need to fix everything under this umbrella that's considered psychosis. But when I was talking with my friend, when I saw my experiences reflected back with them, I realized, what I do and don't want to change and the autonomy that I want to have in choosing that. So that was the main thing that helped me personally learn how to, pick and choose what I wanted, essentially.
Absolutely. I appreciate that, Lionel. You speak a lot to autonomy. Go for it, Vesper.
I want to say that I've benefited a lot from the support of various different professionals, but I would say when it comes to peer professionals, it was understanding the context to some extent of what I was going through, which skipped a lot of the steps of having to explain what I was going through, what it feels like, how dehumanizing it was, right? But instead, like talking to a peer professional, for example, that knew what the food at this specific food bank was like, or what hours I had to be there, right? And I didn't have to be ashamed about asking about going to that food bank because they had gone to that same food bank. They knew what the experience was like waiting in that line and eating the government cheese and all the things that were there, right? So I think context is important, understanding your environment, and that life experience is invaluable in that way. So I would say that has been the value. And that's just one of many examples. When we talk about these distressing experiences, I think it's important for folks listening today to know that we are only few degrees away from ending up on the street, from having such a distressing experience that we can't process things anymore, that we might struggle with working, going to school, or anything else that we're doing. So it's important to meet that with compassion, um, sympathy, and I hope empathy if you have it. So
Love that. Like a compassionate understanding of the context, I think, is critical as well in peer work too. Any other thoughts?
I would just love to say really quickly that for the first maybe 10 years of my experience in the system, I'm not introduced to a peer or told what they were. I remember being like much older and being introduced to a peer and being told what that was and being very confused. But I will say my experience with that peer was very solid. And I do attribute like sort of my current state of aliveness to peer support rather than clinical support. I just never really felt like I don't usually meet clinicians of color. I don't usually meet queer clinicians. It's usually like a cis white straight person staring back at me that has no, context for what I'm going through. But like peers were just like, I met one peer that had like an idea of what I was going through, and I really think that at the end of the day saved my life.
Absolutely. I appreciate you speaking to that, Locke. Go for it, Tyler.
To kind of finish it off, internet's weird. Sorry, internet's weird. But to kind of finish it off, it's a lot about respect, and respect is often not given. I always said is that the doctor didn't know me, they only knew it was on the chart, and they didn't care to ask me what was else. And that doesn't help. To your point, Locke, I didn't know what a peer was, I would say until about a year ago when I met a lot of us in the room. I did have an unofficial peer that we became very close, and I consider them a mentor. But that's really difficult. The closest I've had were people within inpatient that knew what I was going through and also could this and the best where you hit it on the nose is like I know what it's like to come from this neighborhood. I know it's like that you have these experiences. I know what it's like to have this type of environment at home, on and on and on. And that gave me comfort. But what didn't help is that I didn't know services outside of the inpatient that weren't people who weren't meant to do that and were also not capable of doing that themselves because they also needed that themselves. So it was I still kind of have the ability to connect with some of those people. One of them I have connected with from my last inpatient, but then you have that barrier of do I put myself back in that situation of the lowest point of my life just because I need support right now? It's a dilemma, but also it hurts so much because you're like, I gave up on that person. They needed me when I needed them.
Absolutely. And what I'm hearing both you and Locke speak to, Tyler, is sort of like not just the necessity for like autonomy and like compassionate understanding of our context, but also like a perspective of mutuality. Like we have to also be treated as equals and as equal partners in our own treatment as well in order to see any benefit from it. And with that, we are at time. I don't know if we have time for questions. I'd be happy to answer some in the chat if y'all have any. If you would like to connect with any of our speakers from the panel today, let me know. I would love to make those connections. But otherwise, y'all, thank you for having us.
Thank you very much to the members of the Mass Step Lived Experience Committee. Round of applause. Thank you, Vera, for coordinating the conversation. And Vera put their email in the chat, so anybody who wants to connect with members of the Lived Experience Committee, feel free, please. There's so much learning today. And for many of us who are, who are providers in the mental health system, I think it's sort of a natural human reaction to think, well, I'm a nice person. I try the best that I can, so I'm not responsible for what goes on, in terms of the experience of somebody that we're serving. And I think it's really important to that respect and that compassion and understanding of the person's lived experience is really critical to do a good job in the system. Okay, in the interest of time, we're going to go ahead to the last scheduled session, and that's the Mass Step Financing Committee. Let me do an introduction of the representatives from the Financing Committee who are